And this is Melissa Tondi, and I'm very excited to share with you the tester's role, balancing technical acumen and user advocacy. So, what are we talking about today? We're going to talk about the quality engineer traits and skills that have both technical acumen and user advocacy, and accounting for both of those and balancing specifically both of those. We're going to find and address inefficiencies that generally prevent us from shifting to the QE mindset as well. So let's jump in. So the quality engineer, when I say quality engineer, that's certainly not a term that is new. Many of us have been using this term for a while, but I want to make sure that I level set and talk about specifically what the quality engineer is. The best quote that I can see and I've used in this situation is this one. We influence the building of the software before the software is built. And that's a very powerful statement, specifically because that means that we are part of the discussions before the solutions are even started. And that means that we can be very consultative while doing so. And I like to use the example of a pendulum. Everyone knows what a pendulum is. And like the pendulum, we strike a balance between having that technical acumen and user advocacy. And we equally emphasize both of those traits over a measured amount of time. So, traits to consider when we talk about quality engineering. We're curious. We don't just necessarily ask, how is this supposed to work? But what happens if I do this? A lot of times there was this old school terminology when I used to interview, and one of the shoo-ins for interviews, if you said that you like to quote unquote break things, that would generally be strike the curiosity of the hiring manager or the person interviewing you. But sometimes that's a really great thing to go back to. We not only account for where will this break, but the ability to not only think like a user, but act like a user as well. And how do we act like a user is that we actually start interacting with the software. So skills to consider when we talk about quality engineering. Some of those traditional specialist roles that you may have experience with, automation engineers, right? Where you would have a tester that would take care of testing the software and working very specifically with the product team or the project team. And then we would hand off that work to automation engineers because their skill sets were more advanced or more technical than our general testers that were on the skill. So we generally created this specialist role and passed off a lot of work to automation engineers. We generally did the same thing with performance engineers as well. So when we think about those traditional specialist roles, the quality engineering role really aims to take some aspects of those more traditional specialist roles and bring them into more of a general service that we provide. So what testing activities do we emphasize specifically? Well, some of those are test planning and management. Everyone probably is planning and managing their tests, whether they're automated or not, or whether they are scripted or not. And we generally emphasize testing of all the things. And nothing about either one of these is wrong or incorrect. But a lot of times we tend to be inefficient with how we approach those. So let's deep dive a little bit into the test planning and management. So when we think about inefficiencies that test planning or management introduce, we may tend to write very detailed test cases. I know that I used to write very, very detailed test cases when I first started because I thought that that was going to show my understanding of the software by writing very, very verbose and broad and very wide and deep test cases. Sometimes we have test case reviews or approvals where the several members or maybe all of the team is responsible for reviewing and, more importantly, approving the test cases that the testers are going to be executing on there. And again, none of these is necessarily wrong or bad within our team, but those are ripe for addressing to see if maybe they might be a little bit inefficient or introducing areas that prevent us from being as optimized as we possibly can. So what are the alternatives to making test planning and management efficient? Well, one of the rules of thumb that I like to say is always be testing. And that doesn't necessarily mean literally, but it talks about the more that we can embrace tools and technology to make some of the repetitive tasks like test automation or other automation of tasks in there, the more that we can actually be interacting with the software, much like our users. So going back to that quote of balancing technical acumen with user advocacy is the where we actually want to be. The 10-80-10 ratio, it's the only ratio that I like. And I'm facetious with that because I know a lot of times we staff our QA teams by a certain number or ratio of how many developers we have versus actually taking a look into what the work entails, making sure that we not only have the right number of quality engineers on the team, but that those quality engineers have the right skill sets to be able to support their team, again, in the most efficient and optimized way as possible. We determine how much detail is enough within those test cases or tests that we write, and we make sure that that's pretty consistent across the team. Another thing that we may have introduced is that it's the responsibility of the tester or the quality assurance person to test all of the things. That's a very inefficient way to be thinking about that, because as you've probably certainly experienced, sometimes we make that decision because we have little to no insight into other testing. And specifically, what are our software engineer counterparts doing around unit and integration or acceptance testing? But because we generally don't have access or insight into what our other teammates are doing, we assume nothing is being done. So we do everything and we try and test all of the things. Sometimes we test the acceptance criteria as one of the first things that we do when we get a story that's complete. And then another thing that we might do is we run our non-automated scripted tests first. So the way that we counterbalance that or address that is that we become efficient. We look at all of the testing and we assess all of the testing that's happening within our team and not just what the QE, QA, or testers are actually responsible for. We have those conversations with dev. We may ask them what they individually do to verify that they're producing quality. We may participate in code reviews, or we may ask what is being required during code reviews so that we have a good understanding of the testing that is not only happening at the individual level, but what is also expected from the organization or the practice of software engineering's level. Going back to focusing on acceptance criteria, one way that we can counterbalance the inefficiency of us immediately testing acceptance criteria is that we may shift that demo to an informal demo from dev and actually have the software engineers or dev show that the AC is met, ideally before checking in code. And we may invite that we can introduce that into the team dynamics. Know your PO and how they accept and when. Again, they're doing testing right alongside of us in a lot of cases, and we want to continue to encourage that, but we don't want to duplicate their testing efforts. And one thing that I would challenge you all to do is resist the urge to run your non-automated test cases when you first get a story. Explore that story first. And even if you want to time box that to 15 or 30 minutes first, resist the urge to run non-automated tests as soon as you get a story, and explore that first and come back around and run those test cases after. So when we strike the balance, we understand the landscape and shift of our industry. We can see where we may have introduced or caused imbalance as the quality engineer. And by using that pendulum as an example, the shift back to the right towards the user may have increased or may have introduced areas that became inefficient for us. So we want to make sure that we strike the balance and that we balance the technical acumen and using and being early embracers and adopters of tools and technology, all while advocating for the users. And that's where the quality engineer comes from. So when we find and address the inefficiencies, it allows us to, getting back to that first original quote, influence the building of the software before the software is built. And thank you so much for allowing me to share my thoughts.